Hello, this is Adam Carroll from Justice for All with UN This Week. We have on our show today a guest who will speak about peacemaking and especially nonviolent peacemaking. What is it? Mel Duncan is the founding director of Advocacy and also director of Advocacy and Outreach for Nonviolent Peaceforce. It's a sad anniversary that at this time of year, we remember that the US government detonated 2 nuclear weapons over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th and 9th, 1945. The UN was established soon after to safeguard peace and security, but it can't be just governments that work to prevent nuclear war or local conflict. It's got to also be a whole of society approach. And nonviolent civilian peacemaking can be one part of that approach to build alliances to respond in real time, quickly, to conflicts as they arrive. And so we're very happy to have Mel on. I know Mel from meetings at the United Nations. Mel is a co-founder and current director of Advocacy and Outreach for Nonviolent Peaceforce, which we're going to call NP, a world leader in unarmed civilian protection. The American Friends Service Committee nominated Nonviolent Peaceforce for the 2016 Nobel Peace Prize. In 2018, NP received the Luxembourg Peace Prize. NP's nonviolent civilian protectors provide direct protection to civilians caught in violent conflict and work with local groups to prevent further violence in a variety of conflict areas, including South Sudan, Iraq, the Philippines, and Burma. Mel has represented NP at the United Nations, where the group has been granted consultative status. Recent UN global reviews, as well as Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, have cited and recommended unarmed civilian protection. He is currently focusing on identifying and validating good practices in civilian protection. In fact, Mel, I was just now in a meeting with WAFUNA, the World Federation of UN Agencies, with your colleague, Gay Rosenblum Kumar. And it was very interesting that a number of people asking questions, civil society groups, brought up nonviolent civilian protection. In fact, there was a group of youth peacebuilders. There was a group called Global Network of Women Peacebuilders. And there was also a gentleman named Mohammed Sanusi, who brought up the whole of society approach in building peace. It was very interesting. If they were bringing this up to the ambassador of who is current UN president, that is the ambassador of Indonesia. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about the movement of civilian peacekeeping, and you're a founder of this group. What is the history?
Okay, well, unarmed civilian peacekeeping has really been a recurrent vision. We can trace it back to Gandhi's work on the Shanti Sena. We can trace it back to Abdul Ghaffar Khan and his work with the Armies of God. We can even go back further to Maud Royden, a woman from England in the 1930s. And what it really is it's a concept of non-violently dealing with armed conflict, really challenging that the only way to deal with armed conflict is to bring in more guns. We find that the way to deal with armed conflict is to not bring in guns, but to provide a different way, an alternative, a nonviolent way. And so, Adam, this idea really occurred and recurred since at least the mid 20th century, with different groups trying it. For example, I was in Nicaragua in the early 1980s, and we were just testing out these ideas. Could well-trained unarmed civilians prevent violence and protect civilians? And over again, success was being reported in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in the Philippines, in South Africa, in the Balkans. And so by the beginning of the 21st century, a group of us came together and decided that it was the time to increase the scale and the scope and the professionalism of unarmed civilian protection. Up until that time, it had been primarily ad hoc, short term, where people could go for a few weeks and then they would go back to their jobs. And we decided that it was really time. And during that time, it was primarily done by people from the global north. And so there was really a kind of a neo-colonial flavor to it. Now, it saved lives, so I'm not totally criticizing that, but we could do better. And we could do better by involving many people from all parts of the world, and also by helping to make this a profession where people could get paid to do this work and therefore work for 2, 3, 5. We've had one person who's now worked for us since our beginning. So he's been in the field for 17 years, starting in Sri Lanka, and now he's in South Sudan.
Now, I was wondering how many people have you trained? I understand training is part of it, right? Preparing people, local people, to engage in according to certain principles.
Exactly, because that's where the sustainability lies. Our teams, typically half of our civilian peacekeepers come from the host country, and then the other half come from, it's now 35 different countries. And the longer we stay in a place, the more that ratio skews towards more and more local people, until at the end, it is the host country and the people there taking responsibility for their own protection. So let me tell you one story. In South Sudan, where a brutal civil war reignited at the end of 2013, and where gender-based violence is a weapon of war. Rape has been weaponized. And so women have been often victimized and re-victimized by the various armed parties, whether they be government or non-state actors. Over the last few years, we've worked with now 60 women's protection teams who have taken on their own protection and the protection of their communities. So for example, they'll do things like protect their boys from being abducted by one of the armed groups to be forced to become child soldiers. They will protect women from being raped, or if they are, to accompany them to get proper medical service first and then to report the crime. Because if women are not accompanied, they're likely to be arrested for adultery. And so in one case, in the northern part of South Sudan, a women's group that was living in what's called a protection of civilian area, which is like an IDP camp, internal refugee camp. There were 3 women's protection teams working there. There's about 100,000 people who live in that camp. And then 10 kilometers away in the local town, there's another women's protection team. And they decided that it wasn't enough just to react. And so that they would go and walk through the bush to the camp of the main rebel group and meet with the commander. Now, these are women who are traded as part of cattle dowry. And they decided this strategy themselves. We supported them a little bit, but not much. And so they knew if they left from the road altogether, that would attract too much attention. So a few joined the group here, and a few another kilometer later, and a few a couple kilometers later, and they got to the camp. And as our one of our staff said, we footed for 4 hours. And when they got there, they of course were stopped by the guards. And the women said, well, we want to meet with the commander. And the guards told them why that wouldn't happen. And they just said, well, we can just wait. And there were 150 women. And so they got in to see the commander. And the first thing the commander said was, I've never met with a group like this before, which I'm sure was true. And they said to him, and you'll recognize these words from other movements. They said, we're tired. We're tired of our sons being abducted. We're tired of being raped. We want this war to stop. And they engaged what they believed was a genuine dialogue with this commander, who never admitted that his men were raping or abducting children, but committed that they would not do it. And they, after the talk, he gave them a bowl as a sign of a token of esteem, and also arranged for them to be transported home, which probably was in his own interest. But smaller groups have gone back since, and they were telling me that indeed, both the abduction of children did decrease, and the assaults on women from this particular armed group did diminish. And so, but even if that didn't happen, the fact that women who had been treated as property came together, realized their own agency, and then acted on it and did a very courageous thing, reaching across lines, is a victory in itself. And it's that kind of work that is really going to create the sustainable peace. The sustainable peace that then they'll talk about at the UN.
It is very courageous. They really did risk their lives to do that. And I've heard of local people in Burma or Myanmar who engage with the military, whatever platoon is stationed near their village, and which has been making life hell for them.
Yes,
and
exactly
and actually starting a dialogue and kind of a relationship. And it may not solve the overall political problem, but it does build some possibility of moving beyond the dynamic of conflict, and some possibility of softening, at least, the impact on civilians. I don't know. I think you have programs in Burma. Is that correct?
Yes, and what you're describing is very well could be part of the Emerging Women Leaders program, where we've been working with 150 grassroots local leaders in a variety of states: Kachin, Shan, Kaya, Chin, Cayenne, and Rakhine, on doing that localized peace building and peacekeeping, and doing exactly what you just described, Adam. And there are stories about what you just said that are happening in the most violent places in the world today. And we have to get those stories out, because those are the people who are really the heroes and deserve to be lifted up any chance we get.
Last show that we did focused on the Philippines, and we spoke about the situation in Mindanao, primarily Muslim region of the Philippines, where there's been conflict. I understand you've been doing work there as well.
Yes, that's our longest standing project. We were invited there in 2007. And that's an important point. We typically will only go if we're invited by well-rooted local civil society, because our relationship is civil society to civil society. And in 2009, when there was a peace agreement that was negotiated under then President Aquino, both the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front invited Nonviolent Peaceforce to be an official part of the ceasefire mechanism and to be officially involved with two local organizations on the civilian protection component. And so what that meant was for 4 years, we had 9 teams across the island who would monitor, verify, report, and intervene if there were any threats on civilians. And it's important that we aren't just monitors. We intervene if there's a threat to the civilians. We don't just write it down and report it to someone. The most important thing that we did was we trained 300 local people who were scattered throughout the area, who did that same thing, who monitored, verified, intervened, reported. And we had to report on a daily basis. So it got a little tedious for 4 years. But because those local people live in the areas that typical ceasefire monitoring teams would visit maybe once, or maybe once every 6 months. But people were living there all day, every day. And so that spread the reach of the ceasefire and also spread the ownership. People felt that they were a part of the process. Now, that did lead to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement that was signed in 2013. And that was the part by Aquino. It was the ceasefire in 2009, I forget what her name was, the president. But anyway, it was Aquino who signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement along with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And that agreement continues to hang on by a thread and continues to move forward despite all of the human rights attacks that are being undertaken by the government throughout the country. And actually, the attacks are being undertaken by a president who is from Mindanao.
Yeah, that's quite something. How would you compare this approach, this concept, with UN peacekeeping? Because UN peacekeeping may have done a great deal of good in some areas, perhaps South Sudan. In other areas, maybe not so much. The reputation is very stained. But it is some part of the UN work which has grown over the last decade and perhaps should be supported. How would you compare the approaches?
It's a very different approach to civilian protection. Unarmed civilian protection, what we do, is protection from the bottom up, where UN peacekeeping is protection from the top down. We depend upon relationships and upon connections with local communities. We live and work in the communities where we serve. The UN is not allowed to do that. They have to go back to their compounds every night, and usually when they visit, they have to have force protection with them. We will not go any place. If there are armed groups who want to accompany us, we will refuse that at any time. And that at times makes it a little awkward when our UN colleagues from civil affairs show up, but they've got armed guards with them, and we have to say, we can't go. We can't go with you if you got armed guards, because that really undermines our entire approach. If we have guns, or if we have someone backing up our guns, then we're just delaying the violence. But we're changing the whole equation. And so our ability to protect is based upon relationship building and connections with local communities, where if you're armed, your ability to protect is based much more upon dominance and threat. The kind of peacekeeping that we do requires peace building. And so it sets in motion what needs to be done for any kind of sustainable peace. It does more than just cleave people apart and keep them away from each other. But it looks at how people can come together in their own common good and common protection.
It is a very different dynamic, and the only places I've seen the UN peacekeepers, places like Haiti or Macedonia at one point, you see they're all in their fancy Jeeps and SUVs, really very separated from the local population. And I asked one woman selling street food in Haiti, in Cap-Haïtien, what do they do? And she said, oh, they bring us alcohol. So, which suggests perhaps some, illicit black market activity.
Or worse.
Or worse. But the kind of approach, and again, we know that the peacekeepers were not very helpful in Srebrenica, as it turned out. Their orders were not to intervene, apparently. And but on the other hand, you only intervene, but in a very particular way, in a very engaged and embedded way. But it does sound risky, and I did think I should ask, have there been situations where you're frankly over your head?
Yes. I mean, some of these conflicts can get very intense and very quickly. Conflict dynamics move very fast. So there's been, I think we've been, our first team started working in 2003, so 17 years. And I think there's been 6 or 7 times during that period where we have had to withdraw a team from a local area. In every case but one, we've been able to return those teams. But we are not doing this to make ourselves martyrs. So if we can't protect ourselves, we can't protect other people. And we have to be very hard-nosed about that. Because it doesn't do any, it's not a sustainable process if our people are getting killed. And so we have to be very diligent about that and analyze the security situation every day.
Now, I did want to ask a bit about what you're doing in the United States. Did you want to look at your website first or after? What do you think would make sense?
Let's go to the website first.
Okay. So we're going to look at the website and let us know how we should scroll or where we should go.
Okay. I think that if you go to explore our work,
Okay.
and then you'll see what we do and our program locations. Why don't you press on program locations? And then that's actually training from Burma. But you can see that's from Mindanao, the photo that you have up. And if you'll notice, the women in front are the photo before. The women in front for the Philippines.
I think it's circulating.
Okay. Yeah. It's important to note that almost 50% of the unarmed civilian protectors for Nonviolent Peaceforce, there you can see the 4 women in front who all are unarmed civilian protectors for Nonviolent Peaceforce. They are about 50% of our people who are working in the field. And if you compare that to the UN, they now are approaching 5% women.
Wow.
And so it's a very different dynamic. Women, as I mentioned before, are often the targets of violence, their abuse is weaponized. And so they aren't always so excited to go to an armed man if they have a problem. But unarmed women are often much more accessible. And so it's very important that we have women leadership. The head of our team in Burma is a woman. Our executive director is a woman. And that's not for a quota. That's because we need that gender mix if we're going to do true peacekeeping and peace building.
I just wondered if we could look the same drop-down menu under advocacy, explore our work, advocacy.
Yeah, let's do that.
And I see there's something here. If you could click on advocacy, and then scroll down. I think that there are some bills in the U.S. Congress that are relevant here. I don't know if they're still active, though.
Yes. In fact, there is language in the report for the House Appropriations Bill that is now on its way to the Senate. And that directs the Department of State and USAID to fund unarmed civilian protection organizations and to report back to the Appropriations Committee. So that's the language that's in the House bill, and it appears that the Senate is probably not going to act until after the elections, and so we'll see what happens. Hopefully in November. What you see here, let me comment on that, Adam, because that's one of our regional workshops on unarmed civilian protection good practices. That was actually a workshop in Nairobi. And what we are doing is bringing together organizations that are doing unarmed civilian protection, of which there are at least now 50 non-governmental organizations that are doing some type of unarmed civilian protection in 24 different areas. And that number is growing. And they are learning tons of things. And so in this process, we're bringing people together on a regional basis, both partners on the ground and practitioners and a few academics to talk about what they're doing, what is working for them, what can be replicated, and what can be scaled up. So we've done workshops in Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, in North America and Latin America. We have one more workshop to go in Europe, and we're going to unfortunately have to do that one remotely and on Zoom. And then our website and another location has detailed reports from each of these. If you look at publications, or no, if you just scroll down this page, you'll see, if you go to publications, there are detailed reports about each of those workshops. And we've learned a lot. And now we have a team, there we go. UC, let's see, where is it? Reviews and exec. Good practices. The circle that says good practices.
Maybe if we could click on that first circle on the top there. Yeah. All right.
Oh, that's actually the woman that you see speaking right there is right now working with me in Minneapolis.
Oh, well, in fact, that will give us a segue in just a second.
And so people are developing extremely valuable experience. And so it's important that we capture these lessons and make them available to as many groups as possible. Because right now, the UN High Commission on Refugees, UNHCR, tells us that over 70 million of us have had to flee our homes because of violence and persecution. And that number, because of climate refugees, because of the growth of fascism, is growing. And if we added up all the approaches right now for the protection of civilians, whether that be UN peacekeeping or operations for the Organization for the Security of Europe or from ASEAN, and all the NGOs, if we add all of those together, and for the sake of this conversation, said they're all effective, they would not come close to meeting the need, and they will not come close. Mm. Therefore, we have to disseminate this information of what's working, what can be scaled up, what can be replicated to as many people as want it, and to let it make it as available as freely as possible.
Well, that brings us to a moment where we usually do a station break, and the show is UN This Week, and we'll be right back. Okay, and we're back. This is Adam Carroll from Justice for All, and this is Mel Duncan from Nonviolent Peaceforce, or NP. And now we were just looking at the website, but we should also now, I think, focus a bit on what NP is doing in the United States in the wake of widespread outrage about police brutality, about racism. I think that there are certainly opportunities for peace building, and I was wondering if you could speak.
Certainly. Tragically, 2 miles from where I'm sitting right now is the site where George Floyd was murdered by a then Minneapolis police officer with the support of 3 other Minneapolis police officers. And that wasn't an isolated event, as we all know. There have been murders and abuse of people of color. This is just modern day lynching. And that's gone on not only in Minneapolis, but we know in all the rest of the United States, as well as in other countries. And so what has happened and what we've seen is that for various reasons, first and foremost, good organizing that's been led by Black organizations, and including Black Lives Matter and the Black Visions Collective and otherwise, we've come to a moment in history where there can be a movement. Movements just don't happen. They come as a result of thousands and thousands of hours and thousands of people painstakingly organizing. And then at times there's incendiary moments like what happened here in Minneapolis that will bring the movement into fruition. And that's where we're at right now. There is tremendous opportunity to confront racism and to eliminate racism in this country. And of course, we're seeing a reaction to that, as we saw in Portland 2 weeks ago. The current president is making this his last campaign stand. The others haven't worked. The economy hasn't worked so well for him, and so now it's law and order. And if you look at the specious ads that he's running right now about an old couple calling 911 and no one answers, and that's what you're going to get if Joe Biden is president. So we know that he's going to try to capitalize on this, and part of the way he's doing it is by sending these federal troops that are not under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He tested that out and saw it didn't work. And so he had to find troops that were not. So under Homeland Security and other agencies who are well armed and have already been in Portland, are in Albuquerque right now, and will be deployed to various cities. And Trump has been clear about this. Cities with Democratic mayors. He said that clearly. And they will be provoking violence between now and November. And so a couple of the things we're doing, we will be starting soon on providing training to community groups in at least 10 of those targeted cities on how to do violence prevention and civilian protection, so as to help protect the space for people to do their First Amendment protesting, but not have these well-armed federal agents trying to invoke and start violence so that it can be put on another campaign ad. And so that there can be that protection, and that those well-armed troops are confronted with people who are well-armed with strategic nonviolence. And so we'll be starting that training soon. We're going to be looking at 10 cities, including, of course, Minneapolis, and then supporting groups that are already doing this. I mean, we saw the Wall of Moms in Portland come forward and do a form of unarmed civilian protection. There were a group of mothers who did the same thing on Sunday in Albuquerque. And so in supporting them and making sure that they avail themselves of everything that we've learned, so that they can do the best possible job in preventing violence and just making this into photo ops and ads for the Trump campaign. So that's one of the things we're doing. The other thing that's really interesting is the Minneapolis School District, under pressure from primarily student-led groups, did not renew their contract with the Minneapolis Police Department. So there will be no police in the schools. And that, was a phenomenon that really grew up after Columbine. But we've seen it grow, and the response and the approach that armed police have taken has expanded, and not in every case, but in many cases. And so Minneapolis is now left with re-envisioning how to do safety and security and peacekeeping in the public schools. So we are helping them in that transition. And one of the most exciting things is that we're working with the youth who led the effort to get the police out of the schools, as they define. And just last night, there was a meeting where the young people were going through, this is the kind of violence that we face in high schools. And so how are we going to address that? How are we going to address sexual harassment? And coming up with their own ideas, because the real kind of security and peacekeeping in schools will be student-led. They can get support. There are going to be people that are hired as specialists. We will be providing them with 5 days of intensive training on unarmed civilian protection. But really, they're just a small part of it. For there to be sustainable and effective peacekeeping, it has to depend upon students and the community.
That reminds me of maybe 20 years ago or more, when I worked for an AmeriCorps program in Red Hook, Brooklyn. And one of the schools we served in, we started up a peer mediation program. And it was so interesting to see at different age levels the ownership that kids took about keeping the peace and building better relationships. Even some kids that I happen to know from the neighborhood, some of my neighbors, who were not very nice kids. They were tough kids,
Yeah.
that issues, but they took ownership. It was really interesting how transformative that kind of program can be. We're about out of time. So I wanted to thank you. And again, we have the website that people can visit. If people want to get involved in their own communities, perhaps find a way to engage in nonviolent peacemaking. And also, as a reminder, we don't have to link this to the Hiroshima Nagasaki anniversaries, but it is, the next few days. And I did want to post up a couple of links for upcoming events. One is a film that will be linked on our comments section, and I think that will be posted now. That's a 17-minute film taken with footage and locked away in a Pentagon vault for 20 years to prevent the Soviet Union from using it for propaganda purposes. It's very upsetting, but like the video of George Floyd's murder, it documents truths that we must know. So that's the first link. And then there is a fact sheet that we're putting up that you can use for writing letters to the editor. This is from the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. And you can write letters to the editors or op-eds about this, about disarmament and ending violence as a way to quote unquote solve problems. And there's also a link to the Hibakusha signature appeal related to Hiroshima as well, which you can check out. So these are just something that people can do. Again, you can go to the website of Nonviolent Peaceforce. We are also very involved with organizing a conference on Burma. It's the 3rd anniversary of the Rohingya genocide. I don't know if we have the link to post for that now. But if so, we will have it up on the screen. But if not, you can go to www.justiceforall.org/Burma Conference. Again, we're going to be ending in just a minute, but I wanted to give you last thoughts. We have 2 minutes left before we have to sign off. So any last thoughts that you have, Mel, just in terms of going forward?
Well, a quick one related to what you just said, Adam, and that is that a vast majority of the members of the United Nations voted 3 years ago to ban all nuclear weapons, and they are close to ratifying that treaty. And even though it is not, looks like a long shot now, we have to continue to push all our elected officials to ratify that treaty and to join the rest of the world, the majority of the world, who do not want these weapons and want them banished from the earth. The second thing is that we are at a time of tremendous change. That in fact, the last time you and I saw each other, if we would have said, geez, this is what we'd be facing, I probably wouldn't have believed you. But we are at a time where we're not going to go back. There are going to be tremendous changes, and there are lots of contending forces there. There are the militaristic, we're at war kind of approach, supported by the multinational corporations and the fascist elected officials and dictators. And that's one way we can go. But we're also seeing a tremendous connectivity of civil society, of common people around the world, of thousands of people, for example, coming forward and volunteering to be guinea pigs in creating vaccines, knowing that they might be infected with COVID. We see people time and time again. After the day after the uprising in Minneapolis, there were hundreds of people out on Lake Street sweeping and cleaning up. We have this spirit, we have this connection, this unity where we can move forward as a united people who base our work and our relationships on compassion, love, and nonviolence. And that is attainable. And we have now the moment and the movements to do it.
Amen. I hope so. From your mouth to God's ear. So thank you, Mel. And thank you, everybody. And stay tuned. We'll see you next show. Thank you.
Good talking with you, Adam.